Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the 2022 History Lecture Series. I'm Charity Urbanski, your host for this year's series, and I'm delighted to have you joining us again this evening. While this is technically our final lecture in the series, I just want to remind you that next week our three speakers will be returning for a roundtable discussion that will be moderated by Professor James Gregory. So please join us for that as well next week. Also, as a reminder, tonight's lecture will be followed by a short question and answer period, and you can enter questions into the Q&A feature as you're watching the lecture. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this event meets on the contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Muckleshoot nations and other Coast Salish peoples who call the water and coastline of the Salish Sea home. Tonight, we're returning once again to our theme of capitalism in action. So far in this series, we've explored ruptures in the cycle of credit and debt with Mark Metzler. We've learned about the history of capitalism in China and India through the commodity of tea with Professor Anand Young. And tonight, Professor Leora R. Halperin will be taking us to the Middle East, where she will use the Jaffa orange as a vehicle to explore Israeli and Palestinian culture, economic development, and nationalism. Professor Halperin received her BA in History and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard, and she received her MA and PhD in History from UCLA. She currently holds joint appointments in History, Jewish Studies, and the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Professor Halperin is a historian of Israel-Palestine, whose scholarship and teaching focus on nationalism and collective memory, Jewish cultural and social history, and language, ideology, and policy in Ottoman Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, and in the early years after Israeli statehood. Her first book, Babel and Zion, Jews, Nationalism, and Language Diversity in Palestine, 1920 to 1948, examines language encounters in Jewish Palestine and explores how a young national community was compelled to modify the dictates of Hebrew linguistic exclusivity as it negotiated its relationships with its Jewish population, Palestinian Arabs, the British, and others outside the margins of the national project. Her most recent book, The Oldest Guard, Forging the Zionist Settler Past, is a study of the European Jewish agricultural colonies that were established in late 19th century Ottoman Palestine. It explores the importance of these colonies as sites of memory, as well as the politics of their 20th century commemoration as the first Aliyah, or first wave of Zionist settlement. Professor Halperin's talk tonight will take us on a journey through the many transformations of Palestine and Israel through the land's most iconic commodity, the Jaffa orange. This fruit propelled Palestine into the world economy in the 19th century. It generated a new Palestinian middle class, and it sustained some of the most important Jewish agricultural colonies, laying the foundation for ongoing Zionist settlement. Even after its economic heyday, the Jaffa orange has remained a multifaceted symbol of nation, land, and nostalgia that is used for a variety of political and cultural ends, both in Israeli culture and within the large displaced Palestinian diaspora. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Professor Leora Halperin.
Well, thank you so much to Charity for your very kind and warm introduction, and thank you to all of you joining us via Zoom or via YouTube tonight. I also want to thank History Department Chair Glenys Young, as well as the talented History Department staff, Cameron Molinex and Josh Apfel, who make this possible, as well as Richard McLean for his tech support in bringing this all to you. So tonight we will be talking about the Jaffa orange. So I want to start by asking the question of how do we tell the story of a land that goes by several names, some of which you see on this screen. Of course, there are many possible stories, all of which are intertwined. Stories about religion, Zionism, Palestinian identity and nationalism, transnational Jewish history, Middle East history, migration, displacement. So I want to approach some of these themes through what might seem like a surprising topic, but one that I think you will be convinced is a juicy lens to view this land in microcosm, in an oblong fruit known as the Jaffa orange. In this talk, I'll go through the early history of the Jaffa orange, starting in Ottoman Palestine, with a focus on what the orange has meant, both economically and symbolically, for both Israelis and Palestinians, over more than a century of dramatic change and national evolution. Some of the stories you hear tonight may be known to you. Some may even be your own family stories. Others may not be familiar. These stories don't all sit well or comfortably together. That tension is part of the point, part of what we see when we try to tell the local history of a commodity through the eyes of all of those for whom it held meaning. So let's start with a story that brings us back to one morning in 1914, when the Ottoman consul general in Budapest was out shopping for food and noticed a curious display in the fruit section. Oranges for sale, wrapped in packaging stamped with a Star of David and lettering in Hebrew. The packaging declared that the origin of these fruits was Petach Tikva, a Jewish agricultural colony first founded in 1878, that by 1914 had become the hub of the Jewish Palestine citrus trade. The Ottoman consul general surely knew about the famous Palestine oranges, locally called the Shamuti orange. Their exquisite fruit and thick protective peel had made them, since the start of the century, Palestine's primary export to Northern and Central European populations in the thrall of this delectable Mediterranean fruit. But even though it was a commodity, a treat, maybe just a simple fruit, it bore the markers of an incipient politics. The Ottoman consul general had noticed that the packaging had neither Arabic, the majority language of Ottoman Palestine, nor Turkish, the language of the empire. In a report, he wrote, "If Hebrew and the Star of David are exhibited and propagated in this way, this forgotten language will be added to the already many languages which are used in the Ottoman lands, and the addition of the Star of David will sooner or later be added to the struggle of the cross and crescent." The Ottoman Empire, on the eve of World War I, was dealing with enough recently ceded territories and emergent nationalist movements. In this view, it did not need one more. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire was approaching the end of its 400-year rule in Palestine. Having embarked in previous decades on efforts to economically revitalize a languishing empire, its leaders were actually of multiple minds about the Jewish orange crop. The empire had been continually losing territory to other European empires and new nation states, and was trying to reform its management of its existing territories, including Palestine, the core of which was the religious center of Jerusalem and the lucrative Jaffa region, an area that it designated in 1872 as all part of the Special Jerusalem District, under direct oversight of the imperial capital. The creation of this new district reflected and also shaped Palestine as a unique territory subject to special imperial and international interests, with particular ethnic diversity and associated religious sensitivities. But citrus development was already then and would increasingly become exactly the kind of political marker that this Ottoman official had feared. Citriculture was an economic sector like any others, but it became an especially lucrative one into the 1930s. The building of a national economy requires lucrative economic sectors. For Jewish growers, exporting citrus became their way of supporting a Jewish national economy, rooted in agricultural settlement that had begun in the late 19th century, in the context of efforts to establish a national homeland for Jews. Citrus, and specifically the Jaffa orange, would become a major object of Zionist pride. For Arab Palestinian growers, citrus also seemed to be a way to support their own nationalist aspirations, but felt increasingly economically as well as politically threatened by the incipient growth of the Jewish citrus industry. So we'll talk about all of this, at least in brief, as we try to tell a story of multiple actors and multiple perspectives that converged then and in different ways continue to converge now around the symbol of the Jaffa orange. For all of the actors involved, at least locally, the Jaffa orange was a source of economic livelihood, a symbol of Palestine and the land of Israel's modernity, and increasingly an integral part of two national cultures at odds. I love this stereoscopic image of a boat being loaded with oranges at the Jaffa port. It's the same image twice, but no, it's not actually the same image twice. In fact, it's the same image from two slightly different angles that when viewed together through a stereoscope, offer the novelty, or at least the novelty then, of an apparently three-dimensional image. This is a nice metaphor for my goal today, to place multiple images together to create a portrait with depth. So let's talk about the Jaffa orange. There had been oranges growing in the Jaffa region since at least the early 19th century, having arrived either from India or China by land or from Portugal via the Mediterranean. The Portuguese lineage is reflected in the modern Arabic term for the fruit, botucal. In fact, a different Arabic word, naranj, has its origin in Sanskrit and is the origin of our English word, orange. Some of the words for orange across languages reflect various trajectories of trade. This was a fruit defined by where it came from. For those of you who heard my colleague Anand Young's talk about tea, you'll understand how the story of oranges similarly reflects a transnational flow of a commodity. For a time, consumption was primarily local and regional. Jaffa oranges were sent to Beirut or Alexandria or Cairo. By mid-century, however, European royalty were starting to see them on their tables and even starting to prefer the Jaffa orange to the Spanish and Italian varieties because of the protective nature of the chamuti's thick peel. As demand rose, especially from the 1870s, and as steamships made transportation easier and cheaper, production rose rapidly in a city situated on the Mediterranean with a port and with groundwater that could be pumped to the surface by simple mechanical pumps. By 1880, orange groves, which you see marked on the map here in a dark gray color, filled Jaffa's hinterland. And you'll see that red dot will represent Jaffa on all my maps. Jaffa itself, the port city, was transformed by its hinterland, and the hinterland was transformed by the port. Citrus, grown in this very same region, as well as northwards along the Mediterranean coastal plain, would soon become a prime symbol of multiple groups' aspiration to modernity. So let's explore some of those stories. Until the late 19th century, the entire industry, from ownership of groves to marketing to menial labor, was dominated by native Arabs, mainly Muslim, but in the case of landowners and other elites, also Christian Arab Palestinians. Come mid-century, some German Christian colonies were established, part of a much larger Western Christian interest in Palestine. And they too had groves, most famously in Sarona, which is now a part of Tel Aviv. Those owners, together with hired grove managers, rapidly began to institute innovations in production to meet demand and introduce efficiencies. Menial laborers from villages in the Jaffa area supported this industry, and they were joined increasingly by those who had located or relocated to the coastal plain from areas of Palestine further inland in the more hilly region. Thousands of laborers would participate in supporting a crop that required a very labor-intensive cultivation process. The citrus industry would reshape Arab Palestinian society at all levels. Being wealthy as an Arab Palestinian increasingly meant involvement in the citrus industry, which became both the mechanism and the symbol of Palestine's entry into the world economy and the emergence of a new Jaffa bourgeoisie, These were the same men and women most associated with the area's Arab cultural, literary, and political movements, and the associated aspiration to modernity and a broader regional Arab Renaissance, the Nahda. While many of the landowning families were part of the traditional Palestinian nobility, the younger generation included many businessmen who worked in emergent industries auxiliary to the citrus export business, and they became a new kind of urban Palestinian middle class. I think that this photograph of an orange packing workshop in Jaffa illustrates some of these dynamics. And though I can't know precisely what's going on here, it seems that we can see in the background a member of the managerial class, maybe the owner of the business, or at least a manager, dressed in Western clothing. Below, you can see some of the packers themselves, some of whom appear to be children. Some of them might have migrated to Jaffa from villages in the region, along with the growth of the industry. In 1878, just as the citrus industry in Jaffa was entering its boom times under the tutelage of a new class of these Arab Palestinian elites, a group of religious Ashkenazi Jews from Jerusalem made arrangements to purchase land east of Jaffa with the intention of engaging in agriculture, something that was relatively or really quite uncommon among modern Jews. And they aspired to make a respectable living doing so. This agricultural colony became Petach Tikva, the place that would send the Hebrew labeled oranges to Budapest in 1914. They first turned to other types of crops, primarily grains, but the trend became clear by the end of the century. The money was in citrus, and they too joined, and in fact, came to lead the Jewish segment of the market. Beginning in 1882, small groups of Jews from the Russian Empire, as well as Romania, migrated to join them. This was a time when thousands, in fact, millions of Jews were leaving the Russian Empire and other parts of Eastern Europe in the wake of anti-Jewish violence and illiberal Tsarist policies, although the vast majority of those came to the United States, not to Palestine. A small fraction of those who did come to Palestine followed the model of Petach Tikva and started purchasing agricultural lands. Many of them became sites of citrus cultivation. Private citrus growers in the Jewish community would continue to hire native Arab laborers for their menial labor, but increasingly they faced pressure from a group known as labor Zionists to hire only Jewish immigrants, and also to commit to paying them a higher wage than the Arab employees. Some of those Palestinian Arab workers would have likely worked for Arab owners in the past before working for newer Jewish owners. Jews had lived in Palestine in very small numbers since ancient times, and the Jewish diaspora considered the land of Israel a spiritual and historical homeland. However, the majority of the modern pre-Zionist Jewish community had arrived since the 17th century. The earliest of those early modern and modern arrivals were Sephardic Jews, who migrated to Ottoman lands after their 1492 expulsion from Spain. They were then joined by Jews from other parts of the Arab and non-Arab Middle East, Central Asia, and then, come the later 19th century, an influx of Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe. Many of those Jewish communities had historically relied on donations from Jewish diasporic communities. But as citrus production grew, this became an opportunity for some of those traditional Jewish communities to get into the citrus business. So some of them, like the Shalush family, relocated to Jaffa from Jewish communities in Jerusalem or Hebron to work in the industry. You can see this is a packing business owned by Zaki Shalush in Jaffa. And so with this movement to Jaffa, these older Jewish communities established new Jaffa Jewish communities in the 19th century. The oranges, which had already become the symbol of Palestinian Arab modernity, would become the symbol of Zionist agricultural productivity and economic growth. Oranges became a key symbol of Jewish economic revitalization. spurred by real economic struggles in Ashkenazi Jewish communities and European anti-Semitic ideas about Jews being unproductive. And so in response to both these real experiences and also received stereotypes about Jews, economic growth, economic productivity became a central component of a national and cultural project that was also rooted in ancient history and traditional Jewish symbolism. You can see the sort of dual messaging in this Jewish-produced promotional image. It signaled to English or Western audiences that these were Jaffa oranges, associated with a kind of romanticized orient of camels and primitive peoples. But the Hebrew adds Jaffa, land of Israel. Land of Israel isn't in the English, right? So in the Hebrew, an economic claim is being made alongside a historical, cultural, national Jewish claim, a Jewish claim over a territory of enduring significance to world Jews. In late 1917, in the context of World War I, the British captured the territory that would become British Mandate Palestine, and several years later were awarded a League of Nations mandate over Palestine. The mandated states in the Middle East, which also included Iraq, Syria, and Transjordan, would come under British, or in the case of Syria and Lebanon, French oversight. It was a kind of quasi-colonial rule with the intention that the subject populations would be under this oversight until they were ready to become independent. The vast majority of Palestine's population at the time, 90 or so percent, was Arab, Muslim, or Christian. But the British saw European Jews who had already settled in Palestine in small numbers as the population designated, along with the world Jewish community in general, to be the eventually independent group whose independence would be cultivated. The British role, as spelled out in the mandate for Palestine, was to facilitate Jewish immigration and settlement and develop Jewish institutions, including a Jewish agency, as it was called, to coordinate with the British to promote settlement and immigration. The very idea of carving out a Jewish national home was part of a broader post-World War I strategy of the great powers to carve up the newly defunct empires into relatively homogeneous national territories, facilitate the movement of populations, whether willingly or not, to create more homogeneity, and support economic development of the region. Of course, many Jews were more than willing to move, spurred by a rise of a Jewish national movement in Europe, economic strain, and rising anti-Semitism. For Zionists, for the real ideologues among them, the idea of self-determination rose to the level of a dream, an aspiration, and the perceived solution to a range of economic and cultural challenges facing Jews, especially in Europe. For them, the imperial interest created an opportunity, but it was not in and of itself their motivation. But from the British perspective, it was precisely the European Zionist enthusiasm for developing Palestine economically that made them especially attractive as immigrants to cultivate. The British Colonial Office remarked in the 1920s, "We are serving the interests of civilization as a whole, quite apart from any sentimental considerations about restoring a scattered people to its ancient fatherland." Jewish citrus owners who would produce 75% of the overall Jewish-controlled economy's export in the 1930s were happy to confirm this British perception, to claim and show that they were helping support the general development of Palestine. Jewish land purchases increased, particularly around Jaffa, which rapidly became the center of the Jewish population in Palestine. Already before World War I, the Zionist movement, founded in Basel, Switzerland, and later headquartered in London, started to engage in its own coordinating land purchasing efforts via the Jewish National Fund. It strove especially to settle Jewish immigrants on agricultural land. Advertisements for Jewish-grown citrus blanketed the Jewish community, known as the Yishuv, both during the boom times of the industry, but also after, as the orange became a symbol of Jewish and Zionist innovation. So you can see this in these advertising images, right? One of them tells the consumer to drink orange juice. The other is a military recruitment effort, suggesting that one of the aspects of the homeland that a Jewish soldier could defend by enlisting in the British Army during World War II was its citrus production. You can see that image of the oranges. Nonetheless, even as the nationalist importance of citrus grew, the market experienced steep declines, particularly in the late 1930s, when overproduction, as well as the saturation of the global market with Spanish and Italian fruits, caused the price to crash. Arab Palestinian growers in particular began to fear economic displacement in the citrus sector and loss of lands, as the post-1934 crises led many owners into debt. And this debt led them to sell their lands, not always, but many of them, overwhelmingly to Jewish and Zionist buyers. The large-scale physical displacement of most Palestinians in the coastal region, the citrus growing area, came to its peak in the context of the 1948 war, which I'll address in a second. But this earlier combination of threats around Jewish nationalism, Jewish economic growth, and land sales is important in developing this overall Palestinian national identity and politics. The larger context of this decline in the late 1930s connects this regionally specific story to the story of economic crises that my colleague Mark Metzler talked to you about, showing how the global and the local are deeply intertwined in a context of global capitalism. Nonetheless, it's very important to stress that the Arab and Jewish citrus industries both continued through the end of the British Mandate, even as intercommunal relations frayed, with growing Jewish immigration and settlement and increasingly nationalistically inflected resistance on the part of Arab Palestinians. Citrus growers, in fact, made efforts to create cooperatives across ethnic lines and otherwise work together to achieve favorable export conditions from the British, especially in light of the global market crash. These encounters could not and did not exist outside politics, but they demonstrate that conflict or violence was not the only mechanism of interaction between groups. In fact, the realm of the market could, if in fleeting ways, seem like a space apart from politics, even as actors within it pursued or contributed to national missions, or dealt in the commodity that was the symbol of those national ambitions. At least half of citrus groves were still in Arab hands by 1948, when the British terminated their control over Palestine. In the midst of the civil war that ensued, on the eve of the British departure, Zionist leaders declared a Jewish state called Israel. Its militias, which became the Israeli army, the IDF, began to strategically capture lands both in and beyond the region that had been allocated to a Jewish state by the UN Partition Plan of 1947, which was itself conceived as a way to separate ethnic populations to contain conflict. Nonetheless, nearly half the population in the area allocated for the Jewish state was Arab. During the war, almost all Palestinian villages and residential centers in this Jaffa hinterland region were depopulated, as the Zionist movement and then the IDF battled first Palestinian and volunteer fighters and then regional armies for control of territories, including in the Jerusalem area, Galilee, and Negev. There's much to say, of course, about these 1948 events, which Israelis remember as the War of Independence, a hard-fought battle for national liberation against those who wanted to thwart it, and by Palestinians remembered as the Nakba, or catastrophe. But what's of interest here, at least for the moment, is that by building up agriculture on the coastal plain during the Mandate period and before, Jews and Zionists successfully marked this area as Jewish in the eyes of the international community, such that it was allocated to the Jewish state in the partition plan in the first place. The wartime departure and then the thwarted return of most Palestinians in the area meant that while the Jewish-owned orchards remained in Jewish hands, Arab Palestinian-owned orchards were turned over to a state custodian, a form of asset confiscation from the landowners. The various non-owning populations who lived and worked there as unskilled laborers lost their homes and their livelihoods. Residents of those areas, whether landowners, middle-class business people, or peasants connected to various roles in the citrus industry, were displaced internally and also to areas of British Palestine that were now held by Egypt and Jordan, now referred to as Gaza and the West Bank. Some were displaced to neighboring Arab states, or if they were wealthier, often managed to migrate to Europe or beyond. Many of the displaced owners desperately rushed to write letters to those who remained, asking them to try to care for their orchards. Others, however, urgently needed money and arranged to have their lands sold, most often to Jewish buyers. Israel took stock of the citrus groves in its control in late 1948, which amounted to around 3,600 individual owners, most of them small and medium-sized, in 108 locations. As you can see in a newspaper clipping from 1952, the confiscated orchards, now held by the Israeli custodian for absentee property, were harvested by the state and added to the state's overall citrus export for that year, 1.5 million crates. Some of those lands would later be annexed to existing Jewish municipalities or become part of new Jewish communities planned by the state. So I now want to move on to think about the symbolic significance of this commodity in both the Israeli and the Palestinian imagination after 1948. Jewish agricultural colonies that had grown and thrived through citrus maintained their association with the crop even once the groves themselves were increasingly built over with residential, commercial, and industrial development. Petah Tikva is now the fifth largest city in Israel. You can see here an array of seals and logos of Israeli municipalities that incorporate oranges into their design. Some sites associated with orange growing have become Israeli museums, such as the Minkoff orchard in Rehovot, which was founded in 1890 as an agricultural colony. Israel celebrated its ongoing participation in broader networks of citriculture, linking the state to Spain, Italy, California, Florida, and beyond. These economic ties were an important part of the new Israeli state's foreign relations. And when it hosted the 1956 Conference of Mediterranean Citrus Growers, this was a cause for great national pride. It made its way onto a postage stamp. Those who owned the lands, those Arab Palestinians who owned lands, had lost tangible assets. The much larger number of peasants, the menial workers with no legal title to the land, and the group most likely to end up in UN refugee camps, had lost something less legally tangible, but still highly symbolic. The orange groves became a symbol of that loss too. Initially, perhaps still, it was a symbol of the aspiration to return concretely to those very citrus groves. But as the groves increasingly became Jewish residential developments and the Palestinian national movement grew, the Jaffa orange became a broader national symbol, depicted in some artworks as the site of a rural idol, the place of a noble peasant culture, traditionalism, that in interesting ways actually can obscure the urban aspect of the industry and the owner and moneyed classes who are also part of the story. Palestinian writers who were displaced from coastal Palestine in 1948 specifically remember leaving the oranges. Ghassan Kanafani's short story, The Land of Sad Oranges, remembers his family's journey northwards along the coast to Lebanon. He writes, "All along the way, there were orange groves. A sense of fear and anxiety spread over everyone. We were heaped up there, withdrawn from our childhood, away from the land of oranges. Oranges that died," an old farmer once told us, "if watered by strange hands." So this kind of nostalgia is mixed with an assertion of nationalism. The obviously not literal assertion that Palestinian oranges must be cultivated by Palestinians to go on growing. Kanafani's memory itself becomes a site of memory. Others who do not have these same personal memories maintain the memory of the memory. For example, the woman who used a Palestinian cross-stitch method to make an image of an orange with the title of Kanafani's short story. Nostalgia, aspiration, and longing for the Jaffa orange also has made its way onto Palestinian protest and political posters as well, as you can see in these two older examples. One can continue to find it as a symbol in Palestinian political organizing today. When the Palestinian Authority came into being in the context of the 1993 Oslo Accords and gained limited autonomy that involved the creation of municipal institutions like a post office, one of its early stamp designs featured the Jaffa orange. What does the orange mean for Israel today? Citrus groves, though they still exist in Israel, are becoming a less and less important commodity, but they retain multiple levels of symbolism, depending on the inclination of the writer or speaker. Official Israeli government sources, as well as Zionist organizations, continue to celebrate the connection between oranges and the technology used to cultivate them with Israeli innovation more generally, most recently and still exemplified by Israel's high-tech exports. For example, here you can see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs article recently linking earlier orange production with an ongoing history of economic development. The statement is made particularly explicitly in perhaps the best known book celebrating Israel as an economic success story, Startup Nation. A thread runs through the founder's time of draining swamps and growing oranges to today's era of startups and chip designers. In an art installation by right-wing Israeli artist Avner Barhama, the orange becomes a symbol of Jewish settlers taking control of territory. Coverage of the map with Jewish grown oranges becomes a statement of national pride and also a statement of ownership. Orange was also, in fact, coincidentally, the color associated with Israel's 2005 withdrawal of settlers and troops from an area of the Gaza Strip called Gush Katif, an area of Jewish settlements established after Israel captured the Gaza Strip, as well as the West Bank, Golan, Sinai, and East Jerusalem in the context of the June 1967 Six-Day War. The title of the piece both expresses control over territory through the symbol of oranges, right? Oranges filling the map, but also in the wake of the displacement of these settlers from Gush Katif, also expresses a sense of perpetual fear that control over territory is tenuous, that just as Jewish settlers were removed from Gush Katif, so too might Jews be removed from Jaffa, and perhaps from ownership of the symbol of the Jaffa orange itself. Other Israeli artists associated with the political left have reflected more directly on the displacement of Palestinians during and after 1948, and the layered history of the contemporary Israeli citrus industry. The story of Palestinian loss superimposed on an Israeli economic success story. These layers, like the stereoscopic image I began with, reflect one view, at least, of the sort of history I've chosen to tell you today. In closing, I want to present to you this pile of orange wrapping paper, which I actually found in an archival file. You can see on the side circled the string, right, that is used to close the archival folder, something that will no doubt be familiar to my fellow historians. You can see the thin, more than 80-year-old paper flaking. You can see the capitalist networks that resulted in a San Francisco paper company establishing a Near East office, supplying wrapping paper for oranges, right, one for each orange, to Jewish citrus exporters from Palestine. And it just so happens that the Crown Willamette Company actually got its start on the Willamette River by Lake Oswego, south of Portland. The paper mill was on the site of the Crown Willamette log loading station, of course, part of our Pacific Northwest history of the timber industry. So a story of oranges becomes also a story of archives, those that persist and those that do not. A story of land, of nationalist aspiration and pride, and of transnational movement, voluntary and involuntary, of people, money, and know-how. We pull on one thread and many more connections emerge. So in closing, I just want to put up here on the slide some of the sources that I use in my own research in putting this talk together, and ones that you might find interesting if you would like to learn more. There's a documentary film, there's a work of popular nonfiction, and 2 works of academic history exploring different aspects of the industry. So in closing, I want to thank you for your attention and your time, and I'll now turn it over to Dr. Charity Urbanski for some question and answer time.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Halperin, for that really fascinating, engrossing, and juicy lecture. I hope everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did. We have some questions coming in. So the first one is one of our audience members would like to know whether the Jaffa orange is still exported and eaten. Can you get one in the grocery store?
Yeah, that's a good question. To my knowledge, it is still exported. I don't have at my fingertips the numbers. It's no longer Israel's most significant export, but I believe that it is still exported, as well as other types of citrus.
Oh, okay. I'm very interested in the museum that you mentioned that was created on the site of one of these former orchards. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and perhaps what kinds of objects or installations this museum has? Like, how do they commemorate the orchards?
Yeah, let me go back to slide just a sec, so you can see this image. This is a kind of a fun story. So yeah, it's a pretty nutty museum. It's I don't know if you can see this in the image, but there are these sort of fake oranges piled up, and then there are these like human figures that are kind of posed like as though they're packing the oranges, and they're very creepy images. It's like what's often referred to as like the uncanny valley. Like they're quite lifelike, but not quite, and it makes it kind of really creepy. So you go around and you see these sort of displays of these figures. You see some of the machinery that was used to process them. It's not like a high-tech kind of fancy museum. It's very much kind of a local museum expressing local pride. I did meet with a member of the Minkoff family while I was doing my research, and you could tell that he took pride in his family's origin story.
Oh, excellent. Oh, and I just want to mention, we do want to apologize to the audience for, we know there's been a little bit of an audio quality issue, a little bit of a lag of here and there. We do apologize for that. Okay, let's go ahead and continue with some of these questions. One of our audience members would like to know, what was the significance of wrapping the Jaffa orange in an oiled paper? Did that create financial value, or was it simply to keep the orange from spoiling?
Yeah, I don't have the precise answer. My understanding is that this is each piece of wrapping paper protected the orange, and I think the oil prevented it from crumbling. It maintained the integrity, maintained some of the moisture inside the orange.
And this may not be something you actually know the answer to, but was this a typical way of shipping fruit or presenting fruit? Like, were they generally individually wrapped, or was this something that was done for, particularly precious crops or rare things like the orange?
Yeah, it's absolutely, it's still done with certain fruits, especially if they're being transported on a long sea voyage, right, over long distances. This kind of wrapping was important to do to kind of maintain their quality and their freshness. I think I've even seen in supermarkets today certain types of fruits actually wrapped in similar ways.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking of Asian pears and how they come into like in an individual sweater almost to protect them. Let's see. One of our viewers is wondering if this is less a story about capitalism and more a story of settler colonialism or imperialism, and would like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, these are important. Well, it's certainly a story of imperialism, and I've hopefully made that clear, that there were Ottoman imperial and British imperial interests in the development of this industry, which actually led to different kinds of motivations, and the motivations actually driving the growers and the workers in the industries themselves. And I think that's something that is often lost when we are only looking at the national stories. In terms of settler colonialism, so settler colonialism is an academic framework that's been applied to a variety of settings, probably most notably here in the United States and in Canada, referring to societies that were established by individuals who came from elsewhere with the aspiration to create kind of a modern sort of community for themselves and for people within their own community. I find it to be a useful framework in many ways, especially in describing some of the local politics in these particular communities. I think the comparisons are important. I think they reveal aspects that aren't entirely revealed by telling the story only as a story of national self-determination. So of course it is absolutely also a story of national self-determination. This term has been contentious. I think it's an academic framework that, like all frameworks, needs to be applied in a critical way and used to illuminate aspects of a story that might not be illuminated otherwise.
Yes, yeah. Following on that, I was actually curious. You mentioned that the first there was a small group of Ashkenazi Jews who essentially bought a piece of land and established a citrus grove fairly early on. Do we happen to know, was their motivation primarily economic at that point in time? Do we have any sense of what their motivation was?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So these individuals, as well as many of those who came from Eastern Europe to Palestine in those years and after, were motivated by a set of Jewish Enlightenment ideas referred to in Hebrew and Jewish languages as the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which kind of spoke to a need or an aspiration for Jews to become modern, for Jews to establish themselves as productive economic actors, to revitalize culture. It could mean different things in different communities. In many ways, it had parallels with the Arab Renaissance at the same time, the Nahda that I referred to, also kind of an aspiration for modernity variously defined. So these were individuals, so they had come from traditional Jewish communities, but they were steeped in some of these same ideas and thought that settling agriculturally in rural Palestine was a way both to become economically productive, but also for them express a more traditional, like kind of religious connection to what they considered the land of Israel.
Okay, yeah, that's really does a thorough job of answering my question. Thank you for that. Let's see. One of our viewers would like to know if you are aware of any nationalist commodities, some parallels to the Jaffa orange elsewhere in the former Ottoman Empire. So Syria, Iraq, anywhere like that. Is there something similar?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm just kind of trying to scan my thoughts and my memory for what some parallel examples would be. So, and I don't have the numbers here to tell you sort of what becomes more and less important. You have like something like Turkish delight, like a Turkish specialty that becomes kind of a symbol of the empire. It's kind of marketed in a similar way with some of these Orientalist images to the West. You have commodities that were associated with the more mountainous regions of Palestine, specifically Nablus. Like the soap industry was really important historically, and there was some, and that's olive oil-based soap, so based in that olive industry. Wine products became important. Certain areas of the Middle East are very fruitful wine growing regions, and also olive growing regions. So the olive, I think maybe more than anything, especially with the symbolism of the olive branch and the olive tree, has also become a sort of contested national commodity.
Right, right. So that's, yeah, it's very interesting how the orange is not only a symbol of sort of modernity for both Jewish settlers and the native inhabitants of Palestine, but you know, it has all of these other connections as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Like this, the way that sort of the appeals to authenticity and rootedness coexist with these appeals to modernity. Like it's not one or the other, but these things actually get intertwined.
Right, right. The nostalgia sort of coexists with that. Absolutely. Let's see. One of our viewers would like to know if any of the, so have all of the traditional orchard, the lands that were, you mentioned they were mainly coastal, and that they they sort of shifted ownership after 1948, 1949. They're wondering if any of the traditional lands in which Jaffa oranges were grown have been returned to Palestine.
I mean, the short answer is no. I mean, Israel's policy is that it has not allowed the return of those who left or were displaced. It has not, right, the line or the operating, the politics is that any such determinations would occur only in the context of a kind of political settlement. And for all kinds of reasons, of course, hotly debated, that political settlement has not yet come, or not come in such a way that it has led to that kind of development.
Okay, okay. Let's see, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Can you talk a bit more about why the English in particular chose the Jewish settlers as the key population to develop the area under, you know, the British Mandate, as opposed to the Palestinian population?
Yeah, and there's been all sorts of research on this question. It came from a perception that European Jews, and specifically European Jews, they did not view Middle Eastern Jews in the same way, were a more modern population who had the capacity to be productive economic actors, and also perhaps drawing on some anti-Semitic stereotypes. They assumed that the Jews just had tons of money that would just flow into Palestine in the form of investments. So there was that. There was also, once the Zionist movement got underway, there was actual, there were individual leaders who were based in London who were engaging in negotiations and, you know, influence with British members of the British Parliament. And so there's some stories, you know, of kind of backroom conversations that were shaping the policy at various levels.
Okay, it sounds like the European connection, though, is the sort of really important one for the British. Let's see. Sorry, I've sort of lost track of where I was in the questions here. Let's see. One of the viewers would like to know whether the current Jewish state uses the rationale of building massive waterworks as a justification for appropriating Palestinian orchard lands. It sounds like this is something that is.
Yeah, so it's no longer, right, the appropriation or acquisition or purchase of citrus orchards is mostly in the past at this point. Like that's not an active, and many of those areas have been developed and built over with non-agricultural uses. The broader story of the various mechanisms by which Israel, or more often groups of Israeli settlers, end up gaining and maintaining control over land include environmental claims, sometimes institutional establishment, sometimes security rationales are presented as reasons that either demand or at least support Jewish acquisition or appropriation of lands that had been under Palestinian ownership. And this is, of course, this story of land and ownership and control of land and settlement on land remains, of course, a bone of contention within the politics surrounding this issue.
Right. Well, it looks like we have actually worked our way through the questions. So unless there is anything that you would particularly like to expand on that you didn't get the opportunity to draw out in your talk, I'd like to thank you again for such a wonderful lecture. In fact, one of our viewers says, thank you for this enlightening view of this area of the world and of orange production. We'd like to thank you as well for delivering a really engrossing lecture. And I'd like to just remind everyone again that we will be having a roundtable with all three of our speakers returning next week. And that will be moderated by James Gregory. So please join us again next week as we wrap up this year's lecture series. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.